In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to create this modern transparent looking login form, which will contain states for error and success messages. This is a really good beginner to intermediate level CSS project. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name is Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project soon. Today, we're going to create this really cool looking transparent login form with multiple different success and error validation states. Now, if you've been watching the channel for a really long time, you may notice that this is very similar to one of the very first projects I ever built on this channel. And that's because this is based on that very first transparent login project I did. I've changed it, added some extra features, and modernized the CSS, but the overall styling is very similar. So to get started with this design, first I'm going to create an index.html file. And inside of this file, I'm going to put all of our code for this login form over here. So inside of our body, we're going to essentially need to have a div for our background, because you can see we have this background image that covers our entire page. We're going to have a div that's going to represent that. I'm just going to give that a class full screen, and that's going to be for our full screen. Everything inside of here is going to be in this container. Then I'm going to have another div. This one's going to be for our login container. This login container is essentially this welcome screen right here, this entire section. That's our login container. So we're going to need to have our title. I'm going to make an H1. We're going to say that this is our login title. Just going to say welcome. Then after that, we're going to need to have our form that contains our email and password input. So a form has the class of inside of it. I'm not going to worry about the action portion. And inside of this form, what we're going to do is we're going to have two different divs. So in order to make styling these sections really easy, I'm actually going to put them all inside of a div called input group. This input group is going to have our label, our input, and then our little, success or error message down at the bottom. So I'm going to have a label. This label is going to be for the email field, and say email, like that. I have an input. This one is an email input, so I can just put that. Name is email, ID is email. Yeah. And below that, I'm going to have a span. Let's do a span. This span is going to have a class of message. This is going to be for our message, so like valid email, for example. Yeah, let's say valid email. If it's a valid email, that's what it'll say at least. I'm going to copy this, paste it down here for my password. So everywhere I have email, I'm going to put the text password. This will be capital password. This is going to say incorrect password, because this is going to be like our error state for. Finally, I'm going to have a button here, and this is going to be a submit button. We're just going to put the text login in there. This will have a class which says login button, just like that. So that right there is all of our classes so that we can style these different elements. And you'll notice I didn't actually add classes to my label or my input inside these groups. And that's because I can just use this input group class to select my label and input pretty easily. So now what I want to do is I want to link a style sheet at the top here called styles.css. We can create that style sheet off to the side. Now inside of every style sheet, the very first thing I like to do is I like to select literally everything on my page, all the elements, all the before elements, and all the after elements. I want to set their box sizing to border box. I'm also going to set a custom font family here. We're going to use Arial as our font. It just looks a little bit better than like the basic font family. With that done, now what we can do is go on to our styling. But first, we should actually look at what our page looks like. So let me just open this up with Live Server real quick. Click the Go Live button. You can see what we have right now. It's just essentially a bunch of junk, but we can do a bunch to make this styling look a lot better. The first thing we can focus on is that big background image. So I'm going to copy over a background image. That's just this image right here. It's the image we're going to be using for this project. And I want to style that full screen container, have all of the information for this. So I can set the background image here to a URL that points towards that image, which is just backgroundimage.jpg. Now, the background of our entire page should be that, and you can see that that background image is up there, but it's not actually stretching the full size. What we want to do is set the height to 100 VH and the width 100 VW. Now that's going to stretch the full size of our page, but you'll notice we have margins on the top and the left and the bottom and all that because our body has some margin built in. So let's just remove all the body margin, and that removed that margin there. But we still have margin on the top. That's because this text is H1, and H1s actually have margin on of them and the bottom and so on. For now, select that login title, say margin 0. That'll make it so our image now fills the entire page, but it's super stretched out and it doesn't really look that great. What I want to do is I want to change properties. If I change the background size here to cover, That's going to make it so that it's going to scale the image down as much as possible to fill as much of the page with the image. Is going to be the least amount of stretching as possible. Also, I want to change my background position here. The center, so we're in the center of the image, it'll just look a little bit better. Then finally, since I want to center all the context inside of here, I can change the display of this to flex, justify my content in the center, align my items in the center, and now all of this text is going to be in the dead center of our screen. That looks really good. And the next step is going to be giving it that background that's like partially transparent. And you will notice in this application, we're using this blue color in a lot of places. Blue color here, we're using it down on this button. The default version of our inputs has this blue color, as you can see when I click on it. Also, the background of this input actually has a slight blue hue to it. So this blue is pretty much used across our entire application, which is why I'm going to store it inside of a CSS variable, the root of our CSS. If you're unfamiliar with CSS variables, I have a full video and blog article covering them. I'll link it in the cards and description for you, but the ones we're going to use in this video are going to be fairly straightforward. So let's go ahead here. The first thing I want to do is select our login container. This login container is this section right here, this blue section. So we're going to give it that background color that is blue. So we're going to have a background color. This background color is going to be some type of blue color. Obviously, if I just make it blue, it's going to look ugly. So we need to define what our color will be. Well, for me, I like to use HSL for defining all my colors. If you're curious why, I have a full video. I'll link in the cards in the description to tell you why. But essentially, HSL allows us to define a hue. We'll say like 200, a saturation. We'll say like 100%, and a lightness. Let's say 50%. And that's going to give us this blue color. We can change the hue, for example, to 0. That'll give us a red color, and so on. This is how I'm going to define all of our colors, and then we're going to give them a certain alpha value for most of them, like 0.5. That's going to give us that transparency that we're looking for. As you can see, everything on this login form is transparent to see the background. So essentially, all of our colors are going to be a combination of HSL and then some type of transparency. But we only have a couple colors that we're going to be using across our entire application. We have like a dark blue, we have a light blue, and then we have like a medium blue. That's essentially the only 3 colors we have. The thing changing is this transparency value. So in this root here, I want to create those different colors. I'm going to call them primary. We're going to have HSL. We're going to have a primary light HSL. We're going to have a primary dark HSL. I have my 3 different hues of my HSL. And I'm going to use this CSS variable in an interesting way. You would normally think I would write my CSS variable like this, because this right here is going to be our light color for HSL. And that would work fine, but what happens if I want to modify the alpha? That alpha value would go right here, for example. Well, it's really hard for me to do that if I write my code like this. So instead, I'm going to leave off the part for HSL. I'm just going to write out my 3 variables, 200, 100%, 90. Then when I actually use that variable, for example, if I use that variable down here, I'll just say primary HSL, and then I'll put in my alpha, which like, let's say 0.4. That's going to pull in that primary HSL value. It's going to put those 3 numbers, in our case, like 200, 100%, 91%, then it'll add the alpha to the end. So it's a really easy way for us to make it so that the color stays the same, but the alpha changes between our different hues that we use. I'm going to write out all my colors. They all have that same hue, and they're all going to share pretty much the same exact saturation. Add in my commas. Go. And for our dark version, we're going to do almost the exact same thing. Just going to be my lightness is much lighter at 6%. That's our 3 different colors there. Now for our login container, we're going to be using the dark version of this. So we're going to do primary dark HSL, and it's going to have a 0.7 as the opacity. Now if we go back over here, you can see that the color on this is exactly the same as the color we have over here. You'll notice something interesting. If I look at this login form, you'll see that around the corners here, all the way around my entire login form, it's kind of fuzzy looking. And this fuzziness is from a box shadow. The box shadow shares the exact same color as our background color. It's exactly the same. I'm going to create another variable just called color. And that color variable is going to be set to this value. And here, I'm going to use that color variable. That way, when I define my box shadow to get that fuzziness around the corners, I can use the exact same variable for my color, just like this, instead of having to redefine it in multiple places. And here, our box shadow is going to be 0 offset in both directions. It's going to have 15 pixels of blur and 0 spread. Essentially, it's just going to give us a 15 pixel fuzziness around the entirety of our box. See here, if I remove that, see it's very clean lines, and when I add that back in, it starts to get fuzzy around the edges, which I think looks a little bit better. Now we obviously need to start styling how this is going look. So we need to add things in like margin, padding, and rounded corners. So let's come in here with padding. I'm going to add 40 pixels of padding and 30 pixels of padding, just like this. That's just because I want a little bit more padding in one direction versus the other. So the up and down version is going to have slightly more padding in the left and right. It just doesn't quite look right if I did like 40 pixels in all directions. A little bit too wide in my opinion. Next, we're going to come in here and we're going to define how we want the width to scale. So if I just bring this to be full screen, you'll notice it looks like this on a full screen size. But as I shrink the size, you'll see it gets to a point where it doesn't grow anymore. And then as I shrink it, you can see it gets to the point where the actual welcome message is down in size. We essentially have like a maximum width that this can be, as well as a minimum width. That's how we're defining these different values. So in order to do that fairly easily, we can set a maximum and a normal width. So by default, I want this width to be 80% of my screen, which is what you can see right here. But if my screen gets too large, I want to change this width. We're going to have a max width 600 pixels, saying that this will never be larger than 600 pixels wide, but by default, it'll be 80% of my screen size. By doing that, it doesn't matter what size my screen is, this is going to scale and look good on all screen sizes. Finally, we want those rounded corners, so let's do a border radius of 20 pixels. Save that, and it looks really good. This essentially is exactly the same as what we have over here. Now we can move on to this login title, which we already set the margin to 0, but we have some extra work to do. First of all, the color should obviously be white, so it's a lot easier for us to see. We want to align this in the center, so let's text align that in the center. Next up, what we want to do is change our font size. I'm going to change it to 2 REM. And as you can see, it didn't actually mess with my font size at all because by default, that's what the size of my font already was. But if we use a different size, H1 or H2 or H3, this is really important to set. Also, I don't want this to be bold, so we'll say font weight is normal just to override that default behavior. And this looks really good. Now we just need to do the form portion, which is where the majority of the CSS code is going to be. So if we scroll down here, we can select our form. The first thing I want to do is I want to set up my display to be flex, my flex direction to be column. That's going to stack everything vertically, as you can see. I'm going to change the color here, color to white for now, so we can change all that text to white, so it's a little bit easier to see what's going on. Now we have everything stacked. We want to give it some space in between, so we can just say a gap of 7 pixels, and put 7 pixels between each one of our different lines. Actually, that gap is way too close, so I'm going to use 20 instead. That gives us a lot more space between these different elements. I think that looks pretty good. Also, I want to space out this welcome message. We're going to set a margin on the top of 40 pixels to give us a lot of space between the welcome message and our actual input itself. That's going to look just like it does. Pretty good overall. Now we can move on to styling out each one of our individual input groups. These, again, are going to be a display of flex with a flex direction of column. So I'm just going to copy and paste that in here. We're going to give this a gap of 7 pixels. Now if I save, you can see it stacked them all vertically and gave them some space of 7 pixels in between each one. So the way that this works is we have 2 flex containers. One that wraps each one of these individual groups as well as our button. They have large spacing in between. Then we have another flex container, which is for each group itself. This one group has its own flex container, which is own spacing, and then each of the containers are spaced out themselves with this flex container right here. We're just kind of stacking them together to give us nice spacing between all of our elements. Now let's move on to actually styling everything out. We can remove this color for now. We're going to hard code this for our different things. So our input group, we're going to get the label inside of here. We're going to set the color to white. The font weight here, we want to be lighter so that it shows up as a little bit thinner than the rest of our actual text, whether it looks pretty good overall. Then we can select our input, where a lot of the really fun styling is going to be. Our input itself, I want to have a pretty large font size on. We'll say 1.25 REM. It's a little bit bigger, as you can see, like this. But now also we want to make it so that it's partially transparent and it has some better accessibility. It's a little bit wider. It has good borders around it when you select it and so on. So let's add some padding of 0.5 EM. That's going to give us some space to make it a little bit easier to use. Then our background color here, again, is going to use that HSL, but this one is the primary light color. We're going to get our HSL that's light, and we want it to be very transparent. So we're going to say 0.3 as the transparency. If we save here, you can see it already. That looks very transparent, like kind of inset almost, which looks really good. Obviously, our border doesn't quite look right, so we're just going to get rid of that. We're also going to get rid of the outline as well. We're going to add that outline back in a little bit. There we go. That looks really good. Let's add in a border radius of 5 pixels. Actually, let's just do like 0.1. That's not quite good enough. Let's do 0.25 EM. There we go. Nice rounded corners, which looks really good. Moving on from there, we can change our color to our text to be white. And our font weight on this, font weight can also be lighter because we want that little bit thinner text. Looks really good. There's our text. It's essentially the exact same thing that we have here. Both of them look exactly. I really like how this is coming along. Obviously, I want our focus state because when we're focused, I can't really tell. So let's select our input group. We're going to get our focus state. So for this focus state, I could set a border, but instead I'm going to be using a box shadow. You can actually make a box shadow work exactly the same as a border. To do that, you set 0 in the X direction, 0 in the Y direction, and 0 as your blur. And then whatever you want your border width to be, you set that as your spread. So we'll say a 1 pixel wide border. Then we just set our color, which in our case is going to be our primary HSL. And we want this to be opacity here. But actually, we don't actually want an opacity. No opacity at all. We think it's going to look better without that. So if I click on this, you see nothing is quite happening. The reason for that is I want to be focusing on input itself. So now when I focus on this, you can see we get this blue outline showing up. And it's a really bright blue outline. And it looks just like a border. The reason I'm using box shadow instead of border, though, to show you, if I change this to be, whoops, border, 1 pixel solid, not that exact color, this is going to look identical, but with one major difference is you'll notice as I click on this text box, everything moves. Everything on our page moves. You notice that everything is moving when I click inside of here. The reason for that is because I'm now adding an extra pixel of border onto my element that I didn't have before. So originally I had no border, and now I'm adding 1 pixel of border around my entire element, which is going to make my element grow in size. So to get around that problem, I'm just using box shadow instead, and that fixes all those problems, and it looks exactly the same. With box shadow, you can even add like some spread in here if you wanted to, then you can kind of have it spread out like that and give you a glow effect if you prefer. So with that done, now what we want to do is get this message styling done. So to do our messages, what we're going to do is we're going to add a class like error onto here. That's going to give us an error message or success, and that'll give us a success message. So to do that, just come, we're going to select input group input dot success. Success is just going to change our box shadow. But instead of being this primary color, we're going to give it this success color. So let's actually just define that up here. Success, HSL, this is going to be a hue of 100. We're going to have this saturation percent. And finally, we have 50% for our lightness. We're going to do the exact same thing for our error HSL. Error HSL is going to be 0 as my hue because that gives me a red color. We're going to do here 60%. That looks pretty good. Now if I scroll all the way down here, we should be using that HSL for our input. It should be our box shadow. It doesn't look like that's showing up. Doing everything correct. Oh, of course, success is on our input group. There we go. Now we got that green color showing up. That looks really good. Let's do the same thing for error. So if we have an error, then our error HSL, if I change this to error, for example, see we get that red color. So let's put error, this one, we have the red color down here and the color up here and blue when I select on it. By default, if there is no error or success, it'll just be blue when I select on it. That's perfect. Okay, from there, now what we can do is we can move on to styling our message. So let's select our input group. Let's get the message inside of there. By default, I want this to have a display of 9. And also I'm going to set the font size to 0.75 rem because I want it to be. So by default, no error messages at all. So if we don't have an error, nothing should show up. Now, if we do have an error, for example, if our input group has the success class, then we're going to select our message. Or if it has an error class, then we're going to select our message. I'm going to say display is set to block, just so it'll show up. Then I want to set our color as well. So if we are in the success version, I want our color to be that HSL of success. And if we're in the error group, error, then I want to use the error color. Now you can see our message in here and it's red here. But if this error is not there or the success is not there, you can see the message just doesn't show up at all. That's exactly what we want because if we have a message, it should show up. Otherwise, just don't even show up at all. So that's most of our input done. As you can see, it looks. But obviously our login button is way different between the two. Focus on that next. For our login button, all we need to do is just change around pretty much everything. So we can take the padding, we want it to be much larger. Do 0.5 EM, and we have a lot of padding on our button. It's going to be quite a bit bigger. Also going to change our font size here to 1.5 REM. So we have a really large login button. I think looks a little bit better and is way more functional. Also, I'm going to come in here, the font weight on this to be lighter, so slightly thinner font. Overall, all of our fonts are thinner. I'm going to change the color to white. Our background is going to be using different background color. Background color here is going to be HSL. We're going to have that var primary HSL. But this time we want to add some transparency onto here. So I'm going to come in here. 5. So it's going to be mostly transparent. Barely even going to tell. As for a border, 1 pixel solid. This is going to, again, use these primary HSLs, the primary HSL, but this one is going to be a darker color. We're just going to use the full on 100% opacity. There. Next, what I want to do, I want to add some border radius. So we're going to say border radius here is going to be 5 EM, the same as what we have for our inputs. And then the final thing I want to do, outline, none, and we're going to add that back in later. I want to set my cursor pointer. Sorry, it was cursor. Oh, cursor pointer, there we go. Now when I hover over this, I get that pointer cursor, but of course I have no hover styles and I have no focus style. I need to add those in. So login, button, hover, the exact same thing. Focus. What I want to do is I want to change our background color. I'm going to use the exact same color. I'm just going to bump up my opacity to 4 instead of 5. Now when I hover over, you can see that we now have darker blue. And when I tab into these things, I have focus styles on everything. And that's all it takes to create this login form. If you enjoyed this video, you're definitely going to love my skeleton loading CSS video, as well as my animated CSS cards video. Both of those are going to be linked over here. With that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.